Hello everyone, and apologies for the bright light over there. One of the reasons that's happening right now is because with an HD camera, which by the way is really just, showing every single flaw, my light in my office isn't working either, so I can't really get a lot of light in this shot, so I apologize. It's sort of weird. But hopefully we can deal with it. As you can see, I'm in my office at Missouri State, and if you ever need to see me, feel free to let me know. Again, my office hours are Tuesday and Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. And then obviously by appointment. If you let me know you're coming, that's always good because that way I don't, run out to grab some food or go get coffee with someone or run down to the office and meet somebody and then completely miss you. I wouldn't want that to happen. So if you're in town and you want to meet up, let me know. What are we doing today? Today is the official first lecture where I'm actually going to be giving you content a lot more than we did last time. Last time, of course, was our introductory video. And I also made a video of me and my gecko last night, but I decided that was probably off topic. So today we have, I actually did bring the book, or had it in my office. So this is the book, The Rhetorical Tradition. It is huge and it is filled with words and not pictures. This is the best answer to insomnia. First by reading it, and if that doesn't work, hit yourself over the head with it. That will work too. I'm just kidding. I don't promote violence. This is the second edition that I used in order to do your syllabus. However, we could pretty much work with anything. And one of the reasons why that's the case is because in using the second edition, and there's not like 14 editions, nothing changes really very much. In theory, especially in rhetoric, which is 2,400 years old. But, we will say things, for example, as if you look on or around, wow, I don't want that. Excuse me, page 59 in my book. Our book, if you have edition 2, is Aspasia, and it says it right up at the top, Aspasia. So we're not going to actually read her, but if we were, and I said, okay, we're going to read Aspasia, even if your page numbers are a little bit different, I think you could probably figure out what you're supposed to read. So I feel really good that we're actually going to be able to get through this pretty easily. I don't think it's going to be difficult, no matter what edition you have. Bazell and Hertzberg have a tendency to use relatively the same edits and also the same introduction and goals. And as you can see, if you've gotten the book or rented it and you've gotten it, if you have access to it yet, hopefully you do, but if not, hopefully soon. But if you do have access to it, you'll say, oh, I don't need to read the introduction. Who needs to read the general introduction to any textbook? That's silliness. Why would I want to do that? Well, the reason why you would want to do that is because in my last video I talked and alluded to the definitions of rhetoric, and I alluded to sort of what the goals of rhetoric are and also the timeline of rhetoric, which I'm going to go into detail with today. That is a very important part of understanding rhetorical theory, is understanding how it's changed and developed over time. So if you see an introduction, you might go, oh, I don't need to read that. Please do. The second thing I'm going to say about introductions, and this is really important, okay? You got me? You with me? Okay. Bazell and Hertzberg, in every introduction to each individual scholar, theorist, tells you exactly what you need to know in that introduction. So that all you have to do is read that introduction, find out what it is that you need to know, and then and I would encourage this, and then go look at those sections. Those sections are going to be the ones that I'm talking about as well. So the idea of repetition, which leads to education, this will be super helpful to you. So if you read first and watch my video later, or if you watch my video and then read later, either way, read that introduction. It will tell you exactly what they think is important. Match that up with what I've said, and most of the time it will match up. That's the good news. And so match that up, and then you'll know really what you need to know and learn to glean from the class, okay? So that's my big hint for today on that. Hopefully, hopefully I've been very, very clear on that. Okay, so as we talked about last time, the goal of rhetoric is public discourse, understanding public discourse, how we exist in the world together. As you can see behind my Well, it's my left shoulder. I'm having a hard time because it's mirrored. Behind my left shoulder, you might see a book from Claire McCaskill, and you might say, oh, well, typical college professor has a book from Claire McCaskill. The reason I have that up there is actually because I forgot to take it down, but also because she actually wrote a little note in there to me personally, and so I've kept it ever since. You will also see some other books, William Safire's political commentaries, and then you'll see a bunch of rhetoric books and a bunch of history books. And you might think, why would rhetorical theory require all of that? And the answer is because rhetoric, over the course of time, if you study it over the course of time, you come to understand the role that it plays in our current existence, our current social structures, our current governmental structures. And remember, last time that we met, I said it's not just politics. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how we exist in the world. And it amazes me because I feel like every single comedy show we have is just politics. But of course, that's probably because I'm paying attention to that more than anything else. I have talked to people who have said, I have absolutely no idea what's going on in the world. That's understandable. However, you still access certain pieces of knowledge, certain experiences that we use in everyday communication, that we then use to try to persuade others, that we then use at our work environments and in school. So this is actually extremely important to all of us. Now, again, I spent another 3 minutes telling you why it's important. That might be because I've had some questions about why it's important. So let's talk about the history then of rhetoric. We talked about the definition last time. Let's talk about the history of it. So I'm going to put up online for you this thing that I'm reading to you now. Now I'm going to go into a little more detail, but basically this is sourced from somewhere. I don't remember where. It's online, or maybe I created it. I'm not really sure, from stuff online, but it's basically like the shortened version of every single. I'm trying to get it in focus. That's not working. Is that working? No, it doesn't matter. I'm trying to show you that it gives like sort of the overview of each major time period that we're going to be studying. And at the bottom, there's a little bit more about defining rhetoric and some other people who define rhetoric and how difficult it can be. So we're obviously going to start with Aristotle's definition, as I said, as a point of agreement. So of course, Aristotle's definition is the art or skill of knowing in any particular instance all the means of persuasion, or something of that effect that actually includes all three of those parts. So I'm not going to read this to you, obviously, but I'm going to post it online for you. And so if you want to come back to this lecture after you have it and sort of take notes with it, you can do that, but it's not actually necessary to the success of understanding this particular lecture. I think that they can work together either way. So we start off, as I keep saying, about 2,400 to 3,000 years ago. Honestly, we're really not sure exactly the timeline. Why is that? Because the only way that we knew what was going on 2,400 to 3,000 years ago was through oral tradition. So we have to rely on what I like to call unreliable narrators, right? Or not that's actually a theory in literature. But the idea of an unreliable narrator, somebody who is telling us what somebody told them that somebody else told them. In other words, it can be a little bit like a game of telephone where we're not sure that we're getting exactly what that person said, everything they said, and only they said it. We don't know that that's true. But what we do is we sort of establish some standards and some guidelines. And that's important because if you and I are going to have a conversation about rhetoric, or you're going to learn about anything, you have to start with the points that you know and agree on. So we start with our points that we know and agree on. I said there can be, as many definitions of rhetoric as there are students and people in the world. So what do? I say, hey, we're going to pick one. We're going to agree on that one. That not agree on it necessarily in the sense that we're going to adopt it, but agree on it as this sort of starting point for our class. So we do the same thing with history, right? We do the same thing with timelines. We say, hey, we're not positive of this, but we think it's a good guess, and if nothing else, it's a good starting point, which By the way, if you're one of those people like myself who goes onto YouTube and goes down the rabbit hole of reading, or watching conspiracy theories and these alternative explanations for things, or things that happened that people believe are motivated by something other than what we think that they're motivated by, that's because those people are disagreeing with that standard that we start with, okay? So you might think this is crazy, but it's true. Some people don't think that the Holocaust happened. We're like, obviously it happened in the 1940s. And we've got more evidence of that than we do of 2,400 years ago, right? We're not relying on oral history for the Holocaust. We have pictures. We have evidence of that. And so somebody might say, oh, no one would ever argue that. But no, people do all the time. They say that it was created for us and that it was a lie. You evaluate the evidence of that and determine whether you agree that, it happened or it didn't. This is what's known as a fact. It's a question of fact. I know. We say fact and we assume that means it's true. That's not the case. A question of fact, a claim of fact, is just a claim that can be proven true or false. We'll get more to that later, so you don't need to necessarily write that down right now, but I will need you to have this before we start the class. A claim in which we say something is a fact means that we're saying it can be proven true or false, right? Which means there's room for disagreement, I guess, depending on your standards of evidence. So when people say there is no single truth, that's what they're talking about. And to some extent that's the case. A lot of us here in the faculty, I think all of us here on the faculty, are social constructivists. So I don't know if you've heard that term yet or not, but social constructivists, of course, are people who believe that communication, language, creates or at least affects our reality in a very real way. So if you were raised with the belief that the Holocaust didn't happen, you would need a lot of evidence to come back from that and to have it proven true. It's sort of like the smoking leads to cancer thing, right? Smoking leads to cancer. That's a fact. It may not be a true fact, however. There's a lot of question about whether or not smoking actually leads to lung cancer. That's not proven, although in my family it is. But that doesn't mean it's proven amongst the entirety of the population, or as much of the population as we can know about. So that's actually a debate. That's actually a huge debate. I don't know how many of you know that. Nonetheless, smoking's bad for you either way. It causes a lot of other things if it doesn't cause cancer. So we know that it's bad. We can say smoking is bad, but if you say smoking causes cancer, you may have a debate on your hands. So that's where we start, is actually debate. And that's disagreement. That's points of tension. Now, in science, hard sciences, people say to me all the time, oh yeah, you could convince me the sky is actually orange. First of all, yes, I could. But secondly, we already know why the sky is blue. And third of all, that is an observation that we make with our eyes, which, by the way, are one of our 5 senses. Okay, one of many, many senses we may have. I mean, people theorize we may have hundreds, literally. I don't want to sound crazy. So let's go with the 5, okay? So we have 5 senses that we generally rely upon. And of course, that's sight, hear, smell, taste, and feeling. And those are what we call empirically proven to be true. It's empirical that if I walk outside right now, I'm going to see a blue sky, some white fluffy clouds with a little bit of gray. Now, we can disagree about the level of gray, the level of blue, and how many clouds there are, but for the most part, that statement is something that anyone who's using vision can actually determine based on that sense. So one or more of the 5 senses, when we find a truth through one or more of the 5 senses, that's called empirical data. Okay, I can feel it, I can touch it, I can taste it, I can smell it, my son's room stinks, right? That is not debatable. My son's room definitely stinks. If you go in and you use your nose, unless you're clogged up with allergies like my husband, it stinks. In fact, it's going out into the hallway. There's literally no question about this. Why? Because it's empirical. Now, why do I bring that up? Because rhetoric does not deal with the empirical. Rhetoric does not disagree with the empirical. Rhetoric is not about saying there's one truth that can empirically be true or empirically be proven, but we're going to disagree with it. That's, despite what my mother says, not what I do, okay? So what do I do then is look for the things that are debatable. Where is there a question of something? Where is there probability or likelihood that something is true? Whenever there's a probability or a likelihood that requires human interpretation that's not empirical, that's the realm of rhetoric. So, the sky's orange is not a rhetorical argument. It's an empirical one. And that's a debate you can have with somebody else. The Holocaust happened, in my mind, has empirically been proven true. The earth is flat. Well, I'm hoping that people haven't lied to me for the entirety of my 45 years on the planet, but I guess it's possible. However, I've seen some pictures that it would seriously take to doctor in order for us to think that the earth was anything but a sphere. Also, I've flown. So I feel like I have some empirical data. Let's try a different statement. Donald Trump is a great president. That is not empirical. Some people might argue that it is, but it's not. It is questionable. It is probable. It is a likelihood. It is also a quality. So it's not a claim of fact to be proven true or untrue. It's a claim of quality, or what we call a claim of value. So a claim of value like Donald Trump's a good president, or I think that Megan Fox is pretty, or it's really good to be a vegan, those things are all questions of value, what it is that we like, okay? When we have a question of value is when we most often need rhetoric. Rhetoric also comes in when we talk about what we should or should not do about those things that we already know. Whether it's a claim of fact that's been proven to be true through empiricism, combined with some questions about what to do with that, we come up with policy. Claims of policy are about what we should or should not do. Okay? If you've taken argumentation, you already know all this. A claim of policy is we should or should not do something. Most of the time that happens at the government because that's where they legislate laws. Local government, federal government, state government, doesn't matter. That's where they legislate. So that's where they tell us what we can and cannot do, right? Now, if you're talking about whether or not you should get your book club together that you've always dreamed of having, because you're a nerd like me, then you have to sit down with the people who might be interested, and you, as an enclave, all decide whether or not you should or should not have a book club. The people who are interested, meaning that they have something to lose or something to gain, are the people who should be involved in policy discussion. Now, I know what you're thinking. You don't care about politics. I get it. You don't care about the government. I get it. But the government and laws affect you every single day. So you should care. But I'm not going to debate that part of it so much as I'm going to debate the part that this is where rhetoric comes in. In fact, Aristotle, who we sometimes call the first politician, he was the first everything, right? Like everything goes back to him. Math, science, rhetoric, history, it all goes back to him. So Aristotle said at one point that, a rhetorician is a person who explains complicated, complex ideas to the people. Now, that makes him our first political scientist more than anything else. I mean, that's pretty simple, right? So our first political scientist, Aristotle, said it's about explaining complex issues to the citizens. Well, think about this for a second. What about explaining complex medical science to someone who has to take supplements or vitamins and minerals, or someone who's sick, or someone who needs medication to live every single day? Take your pick. Those are very complex issues that need to be explained to relay people, right? I'm a fake doctor, right? A PH doctor. Fake, get it? See? So we were the first doctors because we contemplated life. Doctors of philosophy came way before any other kind of doctor. And in fact, an MD is not a doctor of philosophy. So an MD doesn't sit there and contemplate life. A medical doctor is just like, how do I keep this person alive? How do I keep this person alive? How do I keep this person alive? And so forth. And that's only because of the Hippocratic Oath, right? So the idea that rhetoric is only for politics is, of course, ludicrous. And even Aristotle would tell you that. So let's go through quickly the last 2,500 years of the planet. And by the way, the good news is we don't have to debate religion or creationism or anything else. This is nothing to do with that as far as the history of the world is concerned. We are concerned about language, not just when it started or how it started, but we're interested in how it was used to create and maintain societies. Now, some people will tell you that I'm a sociolinguistic rhetorician. That is true. Sociology, linguistic meaning language. So how we create our world through language, specifically in terms of the social institutions that we have. How do we keep the presidency? It's not the White House. It's not even the person. It's the way we talk about it. The presidential inaugural establishes the presidency. The State of the Unions established the presidency. The communication that they have with foreign governments establishes the presidency and defines presidency. Nothing else. So language creates not just our reality, but for me, it creates the social structures that we maintain, laws included. So now that you know that, the first main area of time is actually going to be incredibly long, and that's ancient rhetoric. And what I love about this is that on my paper it says 4th to 5th century BCE, before the Common Era. For those of you who are still using the other reference, that would be BC. So before Christ or before the Common Era, take your pick, and then into the Common Era. So we're talking 4th century BCE into 5th century CE, Common Era, which some of you might refer to as AD. All right, so that's actually a long freaking time. I mean, that's a lot of centuries, right? And so the reason that they bring it all the way into the 5th century for ancient rhetoric is because it really starts with ancient Greece and moves into Rome, particularly in Rome's early stages prior to the Holy Roman Empire. So I break down ancient rhetoric into two main areas, and they're really geographical. I only do that for my personal ability to organize. So this might help you too. I have ancient Greece and I have ancient Rome. What else is going on during the ancient times in between the 4th century BCE and the 5th century CE? I'll tell you what there's going on. Lawyers. That's pretty much it. We called them sophists back then, and you might have heard that term, sophist or sophistic, meaning that it's flowery language, it's empty, just like rhetoric, right? It has a bad name. Sophists have a bad name. Sophists today still exist. They are teachers and lawyers, so that'd be me, and then my lawyer. My dad was a lawyer too, so I've got it flowing through my brain, my veins. So we've got really lawyers in the early and actually all the way through to the modern era, sophists maintaining rhetoric. What did they do back then? Well, some of you might know there were land wars back then, meaning that the only loot that you would get is claiming the land, which is, by the way, a lot of loot. And so there were countries or states, I should say, city-states, that went and defeated another city-state. And let's say that you were in city-state A, and city-state A defeated city-state D. And so you go and you claim your plunder, you claim the land, and you're on it, and so it's yours. But meanwhile, back in your city-state A, who gets that land? Is that land yours too? And of course, city-state D is like, look, you won the war, but you don't get my house. And you're like, no, I do. I get all the land, and I get to maintain my land in city-state A as well. These debates were very difficult, actually, believe it or not. And so that's where the courts were needed. Those were our first judges. Were helping to determine what land should be given to whom based on those land wars. I know that sounds crazy, but I don't think it's surprising to anyone that what we started fighting about was a material good so in our space, because that's very important to us. So that is where it started. And those sophists who existed prior to Aristotle for many years practiced speaking for others, like on their behalf, as lawyers, as we would call them today, or teaching them how to argue in the courts for themselves, which would be teachers like myself. So sophists were both lawyers who spoke for you and teachers who taught you how to speak and advocate for yourself. And there's a key word, advocate. We know that that's a part of rhetoric. Do you advocate for yourself, or do you get someone to advocate for you? Recently, I was in a situation where I was going to go advocate for myself. I mean, obviously I can advocate for myself. That's a thing. I teach it. I should be able to do it, right? But the first thing I did was researching, and that led me eventually to talking to an attorney to get some clarification. And of course, by the time I left, the attorney talked me into letting him do the job of advocating for me. And he had some very good arguments for why he should do it and not me. And sometimes that's the case. And so I went with it. I'm not advocating for myself. I'm letting him do the job. Part of that is a rhetorical strategy. You know, some things you can't do for yourself, and you need somebody, a third party, to speak for you. This happens all the time. You see it all the time. So-and-so's publicist said this. So-and-so's representative said this. We know that happens a lot. So lawyers, yeah, they've been around forever, literally. Okay, so what does that mean, and what does that have to do with rhetoric? Why did that happen? Here's an extremely important key to understanding rhetoric. When you have two equally opposing forces, I do a weird hand gesture with this, I apologize now, and even I don't like it. But when you have two equally opposing forces, like let's say these two, whatever these two are, land versus land, ownership versus ownership, or, I don't know, think about like truth versus guilt, right? Or harm done versus defending, right? What you have is obviously a courtroom, but what you also have is where the middle meets, and it's very weird because my middle fingers are ridiculously and freakishly long. So where my two middle fingers are meeting right now, there is a space there that is called stasis, or if you talk to Dr. Eric Morse, it's stasis. That's S-T-A-S-I-S, and it's basically between these two fingers, equally opposing forces create, you ready? Stability. In that stability, we would love to live forever in peace and harmony, but sadly we can't. That stability can't live forever because of the probability or likelihood that one side or the other will win out. Now, don't worry, I can answer all the questions about this that you need. Stasis is a point of stability between two opposing ideas. And according to Aristotle, stasis is where rhetoric begins. So if that point of stability is there, and we have to make a choice, which one is more likely? That's rhetoric. Understanding how to argue for either of those sides, that's rhetoric. Now, some people say, oh, during ancient Greece there were all these sophists. Sophists are just people who, spout off a bunch of different crap that they may or may not mean. Sophists can argue guilt and innocence at the same time. They can argue good and bad at the same time. I was a national debater. I understand. I get it. Yes, there were times when I would go into a room and argue population control is good, and then an hour and a half later be advocating that population control is bad. That is a talent not just of sophists, but of rhetoricians. Okay? So what we really need to do is understand that rhetoric is not about debate, but it's about that point of stability and the likelihood or the probability of one side winning over another. Think about the Cold War, United States, Russia, USSR, okay? United States, USSR, in between, stability. We know who the enemy is. They were the two superpowers of the world. We know it, well, they claim to be. I don't think Russia really was, but hey, that's a whole other debate. But these two superpowers were created to be equal and to be in opposition to each other. That means that the world was at peace. I mean, we knew who to hate, we knew who to like, we knew what patriotism was, we knew where the enemy was coming from, we knew what the enemy had. And then in 1991, as we all predicted, I say we all, I mean debaters, as we all predicted, with the fall of communism and the fall of the dissembling of the USSR, we had a scatter. And in that scatter, power, material goods, weapons, etc., scattered, and all of a sudden we don't know where the enemy is, who the enemy is, what the enemy is going to do, what the enemy has access to. We don't know any of that. And as we argued I know I'm old, as we argued before you were born in the early 90s or the late 80s, this was going to lead to increased terrorist attacks, etc. And guess what? It did. And I don't think that surprised anybody really. The question is, was it a good move or not? Well, sooner or later, someone was going to have to win out. Why? Because that's the law of probability. Something is going to win out between those two. During this ancient period, as I said, I break it into Greek and into Roman. During the time of the Greek, the classical Greeks, the ancient Greeks, whatever you refer to them as, we're going to be talking about Isocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and some lesser sophists. That's who we're going to be talking about. They are going to have a debate about whether that point of stasis requires dialectic, which just means knowing the truth for yourself, or rhetoric, which means being able to determine which side might win or what the probabilities are and sharing that. So really, it's about a battle between philosophy and rhetoric. In the ancient Roman times, we're going to be talking about two main guys, which ironically, I had a cat named Quintilian and I now have a gecko named Cicero. So Quintilian and Cicero are the two people we'll be talking about during ancient Roman times or classical Roman period. And they really, at this point, were following what Aristotle, Plato, Isocrates, and others had said. And yes, I am saying Isocrates, not Socrates. You're not missing something there. It is Isocrates. It is not Socrates that we'll be talking about. So in the Roman times, though, they use all of that and they revamp it for teaching and for maintaining the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. Okay, so theirs is really a debate between rhetoric and power. So that relationship there becomes important. After ancient rhetoric, we move into a really fun time of medieval rhetoric. If you go to Renaissance festivals, you'll note that nobody cares about rhetoric there. They only care about whether or not the dress is appropriate. That is, if you go to the Renaissance festivals I'm dragged to. So this is really the 5th through about the 14th century. So again, 11 centuries, that's a long time. I always say, depending on which historian you talk to, the medieval period lasted anywhere between 800 and 1600 years. And that's true. Nobody really has a start point. It's not like one day the Dark Ages were there and then the next day they weren't. So during this time, we're going to talk mainly about the role of the Catholic Church and its impact on truth and the discovery of truth, that idea of empirical truth versus debatable truth, and then or human truth. And then within that, we're going to talk about St. Augustine or Augustine, I don't care how you pronounce it, and how he utilized the ideas of rhetoric in this world where there shouldn't have been rhetoric, I guess. Next up is the Renaissance rhetoric. Of course, we're really talking about a short period of time of 200 years, the 15th through the 17th century. During this time, there was a big interest in rhetoric. And one of the reasons why there was a big interest in rhetoric was because of the interest in the aesthetic, in the beautiful, in the pretty, poetry, writing, beautiful letters. If you watch Pride and Prejudice or read the book, which you should read the book, not watch the movie, but if you are going to watch the movie, watch the BBC version, not that god-awful movie with Keira Knightley. Don't watch that one. But during that time period, people would value the ability for writing letters. That was considered a great form of art and therefore rhetoric. And so we get a person who is both the bane of my existence and also to be exalted. That man is Peter Ramus. When we get to Peter Ramus, he will talk to us about reminding us that rhetoric is something we should study, but then also saying, by the way, rhetoric does nothing. So you gotta love him and hate him at the same time. This is where we get into some really fun stuff because it leads to Enlightenment rhetoric, which, some people say 17th to 18th century. We're not really sure when we became enlightened. It was at different time periods. Of course, there were multiple Renaissances, so there were multiple periods of enlightenment where we learned more and more, and the introduction of science, of the empirical, into rhetoric becomes incredibly important, because now the way that we find truth is very different. We're not just talking about empirical truth based on what I see, hear, feel, etc. We're talking about empirical truth with measuring, right? We have the telescope, not the microscope yet, but we get the telescope, we get understanding of the stars and astrology, maps, etc. Those are all things that become debatable during this time. So what is the role of rhetoric in science? And what is the role of science in rhetoric? Very important question during the Enlightenment period. So we'll get into René Descartes, we'll get into John Locke, we'll get into some people that you're probably thinking, why the heck are we talking about these people in a rhetoric class? You're going to find out. And that, of course, leads us up to what they call contemporary rhetoric, which is 19th to 20th century, which, of course, is the years that I was raised. Wow, that shook the whole freaking desk. Which, of course, is the period I'm raised in as far as rhetoric is concerned, the 19th and 20th century, which has basically been marked by a focus on audiences, a focus on argumentation, the structure and model of argumentation, and how we argue in the public sphere. So we will be talking about a lot of different theorists, obviously because we have their writings. I mean, some of them are still alive, right? And you might think, well, that's it. We're at contemporary rhetoric. We're done. No, I mean, first of all, we're in the 21st century, guys. I need to remind myself of that often. And during the modern period, there was, of course, a backlash or an answer to modern period, and that's called postmodern rhetoric. Nobody likes that word, but really all it means is that it was attempting to break down or criticize and critique the contemporary ideas of rhetoric, which of course rhetoric's about debate, so that seems cool with me. And yes, during the course of this entire semester, we will be talking about women and the role of women in rhetoric, because this book, if you read it, it looks like a bunch of dead white guys, and that's true because Western history works that way. And keep in mind that this is a history of the philosophy of the Western world. Not the Eastern philosophies. Those are very different. In fact, I have a lot of students who come over from China and from Japan, and both, at first when I first started teaching, they were like, we don't understand this thing. Well, that's because Western philosophy and Western living is very different from Eastern. If you have a government that's not a democracy, you have literally zero need for rhetoric, okay? And we're going to talk more about this as we go. Think about this. The more democratic a society or the more decentralized power is, the less the more you need rhetoric. I'm sorry, I got confused there. Did I say the less or the more? I don't know. Be kind, rewind. Okay, no, don't rewind. Here's what it is. The more decentralized, the more democratic of a government that you have, or of a society that you have, communist, really a decentralized power where the people control everything, the more the need for rhetoric, the greater the need for rhetoric, right? Because you need to be able to create that system for yourselves. If you have a centralized or a more centralized government, we're talking about dynastic, some monarchies, obviously not parliamentary, but other monarchies, philosopher kings as Plato wanted, or obviously Caesars, for in some ways the empire of that, the Roman Empire, all the way up through other empires. Whenever you have a centralized power, one or very few people control everything, say, I don't know, Hitler, then the need for rhetoric goes away, because there's nothing that's debatable. You do what you're told, that's it. Nothing gets debated. So the more decentralized the power, the greater the need for rhetoric, and the more centralized the power, the less need for rhetoric. Okay? And that sort of like underscores everything that we're going to be studying. So what I hope you got out of today is defining rhetoric and how different that is I hope that you understand the role of rhetoric in society, not just in government, but in society. I hope you have a good idea of the main historical periods, for about 2,500 years. And I will put this up online so that you don't necessarily have to rewrite everything, but you could take notes with it or go in and fill it in a little bit if you want to. And it looks like that's it for now. Now, you are reading, I hope, or starting to, and if you're not reading yet because you don't have your book, one of the first pieces I want you to read is Gorgias, which in second edition starts on page 42. I want you to read Gorgias, which is just like a page or two, and I would like you to read Isocrates, which again, very short, not a whole lot. Isocrates in the second edition starts on page 67. Now, what are you going to be reading from these people? From Gorgias, you're going to read the Encomium on Helen. Again, I think it's like 2-3 pages. And from Isocrates, you're going to read Against the Sophists, and you're going to read a piece from Antidosis. Antidosis and Against the Sophists. It rhymes. Only those two pieces. So that's what I need you to start working on, because your next lecture is going to be on Isocrates and Gorgias and those sophists, okay? If you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, please feel free to send them along, text me, or put up questions on the discussion board, which I still need to create, which I'm going to do right now. And I'm looking forward to it. Let's dig in, guys. Talk to you soon. Oh, and gals.